Greetings everyone, welcome to our 5th Scientific Society talk for this term. Today we have the honour of hosting Professor Anu Ojha, whose talk is titled The Secret Rulers of the World, the Apollo moon landings, conspiracy theories, and critical thinking skills in a post-truth world. Anu is the director of the UK's National Space Academy programme, a director of the UK National Space Centre, and a member of the STFC Council, the leadership body of the UK's Research Council responsible for national and international facilities and programmes in particle accelerator physics, nuclear physics, and astronomy space science. He is also a member of the European Space Agency Human Spaceflight and Exploration Science Advisory Committee. He received an OBE in 2014 for services in scientific education. If you want to ask Anu any questions during the talk, please comment down below in the comment section. Anu, it is an absolute pleasure to have you here today. I will let you get started with your talk.
Thank you very much, Anka, and good evening, everyone. I'm assuming evening in Oxford or wherever you are. Firstly, thank you all for inviting me. It is a real privilege to be able to speak to you today, but I want to start with a couple of provisos as such. The first is a thanks to the journalist and writer John Ronson, because it was his title, The Secret Rulers of the World. It was a book he published 10 or 15 years ago that really got me thinking, because he's fascinated with why people have what you might call alternative belief systems, which really led me to the title and the main thesis of my lecture. And the second thing I want to point out is I have a number of professional affiliations, as you can see, and which Anka was mentioning. Any opinions that I express during this lecture, and there will be a few, they are mine and most definitely mine alone. Please don't think that they are necessarily institutional. And what I want to talk about in the next sort of 45 minutes or so is to look at, what is the evidence, and why is it that so many people believe that the Apollo moon landings may have been faked. I then want to go further and to look at conspiracy theories in general, and to explore, are there some commonalities in the ideas that are put forwards, and why is this such a challenge to us as a modern society in what you might call a post-truth world, or to quote Kellyanne Conway, an alternative facts world. But I do want to finish on some positive notes, because in spite of the challenge that we face in this area, I'm a great believer that the scientific and critical thinking skills that we all utilize will triumph in the end. But we need to be aware of some of the challenges ahead of us. So about 45 minutes, and then I'll be delighted to take any questions at the end. But if I'm going to talk about the Apollo moon landings, first of all, I just want to approach again the idea of space, because to many people's minds, as soon as you talk about space, the idea comes to mind that we are talking about something that is far, far away. We are talking about, thousands of miles or kilometers away, or light seconds, light minutes, light years even. For many people, it's very surprising when they realize that space is incredibly close to us. In fact, the internationally accepted boundary of space is only 100 kilometers away. That's 62 miles. Space is closer to where I am now than the University of Oxford, and I'm deep in the Leicestershire countryside at the moment. The problem is, of course, that 100 kilometers is straight up. Now, to get up there, we've got to battle against gravity, a force that's dominated the way that life's evolved on this planet for billions of years. And if we want to stay in the space environment, we have to deal with an environment from a radiation, from a thermal, from a pressure perspective that's far more challenging than anything we experience naturally here on the surface of the Earth. So have no doubt about it, we might have been doing space stuff, for more than 60 years. But even now, it's pushing our science and our technology to its very limit. But of course, when we get there, the view is literally breathtaking. What you're seeing now is time-lapse imagery taken from on board the International Space Station. It is accelerated in places, but what I love about this is not only the unparalleled clarity with which we see the cosmos and the living physics lesson of the solar wind being funneled by Earth's magnetic field and interacting with the upper atmosphere to produce the aurora borealis and australis, the northern and southern lights. What's also astonishing to me is the pace of human development, because since the 1960s, with human space flight's beginnings, astronauts and cosmonauts have reported they can see that incremental growth in the pattern of city lights. We are seeing the development of prosperity on a timescale of decades, especially in areas of Asia and increasingly in areas of Southern Africa and other parts of the world. And of course, this overview effect, I think, is one of the reasons why space is such a trope, such a draw for so many people, even though they may not end up working in the space sector. But, make no mistake, space is not easy, because in spite of the beauty of these views and the ubiquity of social media to spread these sorts of perspectives, the number of people who've ever had this view in human history is less than 600. They would comfortably fit inside an Airbus A380 Super Jumbo. And 19 of those have died in the process of either going into space or coming back from space. And so space is not easy, but it still challenges us and it inspires us. What were the origins of the space race? Well, if we have to look at that, we need to think about geopolitics, because of course, after the carnage of World War II, what arose from those geopolitical ashes were two competing ideological systems: communism, capitalism, the Soviet Union and the United States. And certainly from the United States perspective, there was absolute paranoia about what the rise of communism would mean. And of course, this is what led to the challenge to showcase to the rest of the world your superiority in attaining that final frontier. These were the drivers geopolitically for the space race. And it's fair to say that in the space of 4 short years, between 1957 and 1961, the United States got a double body blow to its pride. On the left, you can see an image from the 4th of October 1957. This was the launch of the world's first satellite, Sputnik 1, by the Soviet Union. Now, from the United States perspective, it may have looked relatively primitive. It was about 84 kilograms, and it had cadmium batteries on board and a transmitter that pretty much just went beep, beep, beep. In fact, the tone did vary depending upon the internal pressure of the assembly. So you could say it was scientific instrumentation. But from the Americans' perspective, as primitive as it may have seemed, it was orbiting the Earth 16 times a day. It was passing over their territory every single day with triumphal impunity. And you can see the headlines there in the New York Times. So having lost round 1 of the space race, the second body blow to the pride came less than 4 years later. April the 12th, 1961, when Yuri Gagarin launched into space, almost just about completed 1 orbit of the Earth, and landed a worldwide celebrity. And you cannot overstate how much this was a shock to the United States psyche. And of course, it was this that led President Kennedy to set what is arguably one of the boldest national goals that the United States has ever seen: the challenge of getting a human being onto the surface of the moon and back again within a decade. Now, you read a lot of things about Kennedy, and this was thought to be impossible at the time, and we didn't have the materials, blah, blah, blah. Kennedy knew it was achievable, but he knew that it would take a concerted national effort that in the end harnessed nearly 500,000 of America's best engineers, scientists, lawyers, metallurgists, a whole range of professional backgrounds and work streams. And funding doesn't solve everything, but what's interesting is that at the peak of Project Apollo in 1964, 1965, NASA was taking nearly 4% of the US federal budget. Compare that nowadays with about 0.4, 0.5%. As I say, money doesn't solve all problems, but chucking money at problems can help accelerate the progress towards solutions. And I want to show you something here that I think is really important to remember. What you can see here on the top left is not a computer montage. This is imagery taken from a satellite that's currently orbiting the sun. It's at the Earth-Sun Lagrange point 1. It's called Deep Space Climate Observatory. It's a NASA satellite that's looking back at the Earth. And what I love about this image is we can see the far side of the moon, the side of the moon that we never see from the Earth, beautifully transiting across the Eastern Pacific. You'll see on the top right corner, I've got some fundamental data about the Earth-Moon system. And in the bottom, I've got the sort of imagery that we're all familiar with. I've taken this particular one, of course, from Encyclopedia Britannica. Now, why I'm showing this to you is that, you know, we are here, and the majority of you are training as scientists or as scientists. You know, we think in the language of mathematics, but even we can get misled by visual imagery. We are fundamentally a very visual species. And when we look at a diagram like this, of course, the data is not telling us that this picture is real, but we still get misled. Because, of course, if I was to do a scale demonstration of what the language of mathematics is actually telling us, and the Earth was a football this big, you know, the moon would not be here or here. The moon would be a tennis ball about 30 feet away. The moon is 1,000 times the distance to the International Space Station. And so the challenge of the distance that we were going to go, especially in the early 1960s when we barely got humans into space, is just one of the challenges that was being faced by NASA in attaining Kennedy's national goal. And of course, we all know the story. Between 1968 and 1972, 24 human beings went to the moon. 12 of them walked on its surface. And, you know, to date, these are amongst the most audacious voyages of discovery that the human race has ever undergone. Arguably, one of the greatest triumphs in the history of humankind. Or was it?
Tonight,
liftoff. We have a liftoff.
we investigate the most extraordinary event of the
That's one small step for man,
man landing on the moon.
one giant leap for mankind.
But believe it or not, some people say it never happened.
This whole thing was a fake.
Decide for yourself as we explore the evidence,
The Eagle has landed.
analyze official government photos,
What a ride, what a ride.
examine the films,
The flag flaps on the moon where there's no atmosphere.
and hear the testimony of one former astronaut who's not afraid to speak his mind.
NASA could have covered it up.
Could the government have orchestrated the deception of the century?
NASA could have pulled off the greatest hoax of all time.
You be the judge. On Conspiracy Theory, did we land on the moon?
You know, every time I use that video, I see that video, I don't know whether to laugh or cry or throw something at the screen. It is actually a masterclass in sort of how to use media clips selectively cut and edited to give a very seductive but ultimately distorted picture. It's a trailer for a program that first came out on Fox television in the United States, Conspiracy Theory, Did We Land on the Moon? And as time has gone on, you know, this conspiracy theory has exploded out of all proportion and out of all, you know, in terms of its influence on popular society. And of course, it's the basis of part one of my lecture. Now, before we look at some of the issues with the Apollo moon landings conspiracy theory, I want to take a step back and to differentiate between urban myths and conspiracy theories. And these are very personal definitions. So on the screen now, I have three examples that I'm going to use to illustrate the idea of urban myths. So an urban myth is something in my mind that can be based on a very simplistic modeling using the laws of physics or ideas from science, which are then extrapolated well beyond their parameter space. And let me explain what I mean. You know, on the left hand side, we've got the Empire State Building, and I think many of you may have heard the story that, you know, if you throw a £1 coin off the top of the Empire State Building and somebody's underneath, you know, if it lands on them, it's going to kill them. You know, whoever did that modeling has probably got a sort of maybe a school level modeling of acceleration in gravity fields. But they haven't taken into account the effect of air resistance. So while I would not want to be underneath a £1 coin thrown off the top of the Empire State Building, it's not going to kill me. On the top right, you can see my representation with satellite imagery of a cyclone. This was Cyclone Philin that hit the southwest coast of India in 2013. And what I'm showing there is you can see the rotation of that cyclone system in the northern hemisphere. I'm showing that to you because there are people who think that when you look at cyclones and typhoons and the circulation in the northern hemisphere is in one direction, the southern hemisphere the other direction, that is real, and it's a product of the Coriolis effect. So the effect of the Earth's rotation at differential latitudes upon large bodies of fluid like the Earth's atmosphere. Now that's been extrapolated, and people say that that's why water goes down the plug hole one way if you're north of the equator and the other way if you're south of the equator. Now that's not true. If somebody demonstrates that, then they've fixed it in terms of having a sink that's been designed to do that, because the Coriolis effect will apply to large bodies of fluid, but it's not going to apply to something as small as a sink with a plug that is removed. And underneath, finally, I've got the Great Wall of China, because many of you may have read that the Great Wall of China is the only human-made object that's visible from the moon. Now, whoever's done that has looked at the overall length of the Great Wall of China, integrated it to find 4,000 kilometers, and said, well, if you've got a 4,000 kilometer structure on Earth and you are the distance to the moon, the human eye can resolve it. They're talking about length, but not about width. This structure is less than 6 meters wide at its widest point. And in fact, even in low Earth orbit, astronauts say they have not been able to fully resolve the width of the Great Wall of China, and that's from low Earth orbit. So you can't see it with the naked eye from the moon. So these are examples of what I call urban myths, and they're relatively harmless. In fact, they're really good starters if you're a physics student at school or even higher, to look at the modeling that's being done and then to try to get a more realistic modeling to appraise the situation. I think conspiracy theories are much more insidious. And I've got on the screen now some examples, apart from our moon landing one, of some of the conspiracy theories that we see widely circulating. What's really disturbing to me is that, of course, when you look at the conspiracy theories in the top right, these have become not only mainstream but believed at senior level in many governments when you talk about the reality of the Holocaust being questioned. And in the bottom right hand side, the World Trade Center, the attacks on 9/11, arguably the seminal moment in the early 21st century that defined geopolitics for the next decade. We will look at some of the issues around 9/11 and what's put forward by conspiracy theories a little bit later. But what about Apollo? Well, here are some of the arguments that are put forward. And the first thing I want to highlight is you'll see that I've really gone overboard on capital letters and exclamation marks. This is because, from my understanding, when you are online, this means you are shouting. And of course, online is the ecosystem in which so many of these ideas will absolutely thrive. Now, the ideas that I've put forward there, fluttering flags, no Kratos, looks like slowed down footage. And of course, the fact that we haven't gone back for half a century. What I'm not going to do, these are legitimate questions to ask. What I'm not going to do is to take every single argument that's put forward by conspiracy theorists. But what I'm going to do is take a few of them and just show that the argument that the conspiracist is putting forward to explain the phenomenon that's seen is not the only one, and in many cases is not consistent with science and with everyday experiences that we all have. In other words, part of the scientific principle, as we know, is that we take different arguments and we rigorously interrogate them when they are used to support explaining a phenomena that's observed. And as we'll see, this is not the way that conspiracists will work. So we'll go through a few of the examples. In my first image here, this is, as far as the conspiracists are concerned, a smoking gun of evidence that we never went to the moon. Because if we look on the surface of the moon here, we can see a shadow of the astronaut and we can see a shadow of an instrument that's been put into the surface. Now, what the conspiracist will say is that, if the only light source was the sun, 93 million miles, so 140 odd million kilometers away, surely those shadows should have been parallel, but here they are not. They are converging to a point. Therefore, the image is a fake, and it was shot in a studio with a light source much closer. Now, that's one explanation. But of course, what the conspiracist doesn't tell you is that anytime you are trying to reduce a three-dimensional scene onto a two-dimensional representation, you get issues of perspective. And so when you see these shadows seemingly converging to a point, you have an effect of perspective. That, of course, is the explanation that scientists would use. And this is a phenomenon that all of you will have seen in your everyday lives, because here we've got exactly the same phenomenon reproduced on Earth. And we don't question the validity of the reality of an image like this. You see shadows converging all the time, and you don't start questioning whether the sun is really 93 million miles away. Of course, when it comes down to perspective, there's another issue, which is non-level terrain, because of course, as soon as you've got a terrain that is slightly undulating, you start to get shadows going in all sorts of directions, as we see here. So what I'm not saying is that the conspiracist is wrong, end of story. I'm saying the conspiracist is giving you a very limited explanation, that perhaps there is an alternative explanation, which is much more consistent with scientific principles and much more consistent with observations that we've all made, whether we register them or not. The second issue that's often brought up that I want to illustrate. Okay, I'm assuming that we're back connected. The joys of technology. The second issue that I'd like to talk about is one that's often brought up, and it's about the Earth's Van Allen radiation belts. This was arguably the first scientific discovery of the space age. It was the first US discovery, the satellite Explorer 1 in January 1958, that made this discovery. That when we look at the Earth's magnetic field, there are regions in the Earth's magnetic field where high energy charged particles from the sun, primarily protons and electrons, are trapped and oscillate. And we see the inner and the outer Van Allen radiation belts here. Now, these are very, very hostile regions. The conspiracist will say that surely, looking at the Apollo command module and its limited shielding, that there is no way that could have protected astronauts traversing through the Van Allen radiation belts on their journey to the moon. And this diagram is pretty much to scale. Now, what they say is correct. You know, if you are going to hang around in the Earth's Van Allen radiation belts, you are going to get a pretty lethal dose of radiation very, very quickly, especially in a setup like the Apollo command module. But my answer to why this didn't happen can be best illustrated by something that perhaps you will have known people who've done, which is the idea of firewalking. You know, if you hang around in the Earth's Van Allen radiation belts, you're going to get a lethal dose. But of course, the Van Allen radiation belts were traversed at a time when there was pretty much maximal velocity leaving the Earth. Transit time through those belts was very, very short. Just as if you are walking across a fire pit, your feet do not burn because your transit time is short. What you do not do if you are firewalking is stop to have a chat when you are standing in the middle. That's when the thermal conduction of your feet will allow your feet to get burnt. And in a similar way, the rapid transit time through the Van Allen radiation belts meant that the conspiracist is right at one level, but is not giving you the full picture. And when you think about the full mission parameters and basics of science, you can see that the Van Allen belt is not an issue. Another image that's often used is this. This is actually one of my favorite images of Jim Irwin from the Apollo 15 mission saluting the flag in 1971. And to a conspiracist, again, we've got a smoking gun of evidence because, you know, we're looking here. We're in the hyper clear lunar environment with no atmosphere. The sky is blacker than any black that we've experienced on Earth. And of course, this should be full of stars, but it's not, because the image was faked in a film studio. Now, that's one explanation. But of course, the reason scientifically is that the exposure time of the picture was so short. Imagine, this is a completely alien environment. We have a sky that is black. We've got a surface that is incredibly bright. And if you want to take a traditional photographic image, you want to make sure the exposure time is short enough so that you can see your features. If you actually wanted to see the stars against this very, very bright surface background, your exposure time would be so long that you would just get a complete white mess before you got any stars that were visible. In other words, it's a product of photographic exposure time. And what the conspiracist doesn't tell you is, of course, any time when you are in low Earth orbit on the day side of the Earth, you see the same effect at work. So here we've got images on two images of the International Space Station and an image of repairing the Hubble Space Telescope. And once again, on the daylight side of an Earth orbit, photographs will never show stars. Okay, the exposure time is too short because of the brightness of the Earth's surface. Of course, you then go one step further, and there are some conspiracists who will accept you, but there are others who will say, no, 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 all of these pictures are faked. And all I can say to that is, how far down the rabbit's holes do you have to go? We must guard against this. One of the fundamental principles of science is that if our theories are challenged, and if they're challenged successfully, we accept the evidence that's put forward and we modify our theories. We don't just obstinately hang on because, we have a sense of pride that is involved as well. What I've got here is another issue. This is Buzz Aldrin on Apollo 11. It's a GIF that's been done, and you can see here he is saluting the American flag. And what I'm showing here is we've got a US flag on the surface of the moon, and it seems to be flapping in the wind. And the conspiracy theorists will show you this image and say, well, how can that be possible? Now, I've deliberately chosen these images because here you've got Buzz saluting the flag, and you can see the flag is completely still. Remember, the United States flag is such a potent symbol of the nation. It was an absolute priority to have this displayed on the mission. And of course, when you look at how this was going to be stowed away in the lunar module, the only way to do it is to fold it up. And the only way to make it actually show as it was deployed on the surface of the moon was to have a telescopic pole that you can see extended up the top. And that's why when the flag was extended, it just hauntingly maintains this frozen position. Now, you can see it here with Buzz saluting the flag. What the conspiracist doesn't show you are, to me, some of the most haunting images from Project Apollo, especially on the later missions. So with a much better resolving video camera system, you see images of the astronauts moving around and the flag stays completely frozen. It's completely different to any experience we see on Earth. What's interesting as well, the only time the flag does move is an astronaut inadvertently displaces it, and then what you see is it oscillating as a pendulum would in a 1/6 gravitational field. That's the really haunting imagery. But again, the conspiracy theorist does not showcase the alternative explanations. And of course, in science, what we will do is to say there's this explanation and this explanation. The conspiracy theorist is deliberately trying to funnel you down into one rabbit hole way of thinking. One issue that I think is worth thinking about is this whole idea of computer design, computer speeds, computer capability, especially when we're at a time when these are ubiquitous. And in many people's minds, having this sort of computational power is absolutely essential if you're going to do any type of navigation in space or even on Earth when you look at sat-nav. What I'm showing here are the computer architectures that were on board the Apollo command module, and they're absolutely archaic. 36K of memory, operating at a speed of barely 2 million cycles per second. You do not need massive amounts of onboard computational ability to navigate to the moon or even to fly an aircraft. And my best example to show is with this. This is an aircraft called the XB-70 Valkyrie, and to me this looks futuristic today. This was a Mach 3 supersonic bomber prototype. Two of them were built. It was built and flown in the early 1960s. It actually had wings that would come downwards, so it could ride on its own shockwave when it was traveling supersonically. Now, this looks futuristic now, but when you look in the cockpit of the XB-70, it was a completely analog display system. And many people are really shocked at this, that so many of the aviation milestones and the aerospace and space milestones were done with analog instrumentation. You do not need huge amounts, as I say, of computation ability on board to do fundamental principles in aerodynamics or in astronavigation, as long as you have a backup on Earth that can do some of that processing for you. And of course, if you look at that wonderful exposition in the film First Man, this brings home the relative primitiveness of the technology on board the Apollo and Gemini spacecraft very, very well. Just because it was primitive doesn't mean it wasn't very, very effective at what it had to do. I want to introduce you to one of the foremost conspiracy theorists in the United Kingdom. He's a gentleman called Marcus Allen, and he is the publisher of a magazine called Nexus that you can see in many newsagents, certainly in the United Kingdom. This is a magazine that looks at alternative explanations for things. And so when we look at it, this is a relatively old copy here. It starts with global warming fraud. Well, I agree. I think we should be looking at evidence for whenever anything is put forward, be it global warming or another issue. The 9/11 deception, okay, we can look at some of the arguments that are there, but then it really starts going off at the deep end, where crimes of the popes, and then time travel portals and weather wars. Now, the reason I'm introducing Marcus Allen is that he was one of the foremost proponents of the Apollo moon conspiracy theories in the 1990s. And he was asked once, and he said, look, he was asked, what will make you believe? And he said, if I see satellite imagery, a satellite orbiting the moon, that shows imagery of the old Apollo landing site, then I'll be convinced. Well, lo and behold, in 2008 or 2009, NASA dispatched the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter. It's still orbiting the moon now. And we have imaged all of the Apollo landing sites. Now, what you're seeing on the left-hand side is the imagery that Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter took on the last landing site at Taurus Littrow, Apollo 17, December 1972. And on the right-hand side, the Apollo 15 landing site, where Jim Irwin was saluting the flag, and Hadley Rill. And what's haunting to me is that we've got the wheeled tracks, we've got the footprints as if they were made yesterday. On an environment where there's no atmosphere, those footprints and tire tracks are going to maintain their integrity for millions of years before they're slowly erased by micrometeorite rain. We have left our mark on the cosmos. Now, you'd like to think that Marcus Allen would then do what he said he was going to do and accept the reality of Apollo. But does he? Absolutely not. His response, well, these images are faked. And once again, what levels of proof do we need if people are not going to take those on board, but they're just going to keep on going down those rabbit holes? This is an image from a while ago. It's a time when I was less follically challenged than I am now. This is me at Johnson Space Center in Texas, standing next to one of the 3 Apollo Saturn V rockets that were left over at the end of the program and never got used. The Saturn V was the largest rocket ever built that was successfully used in spaceflight, and it was an absolute beast. 110 meters tall, a massive 3,000 tons at liftoff. Each of those F1 engines there was using 3 tons of propellant, in this case kerosene and oxygen, every second. And the last Saturn V launch in 1972 for Apollo 17, it was a night launch. It was seen more than 500 miles away. And the Apollo missions were tracked all of the way by amateurs as well as professionals to the moon. You cannot fake a launch of a Saturn V and just have it lurking in low Earth orbit. Everyone would see it there. And yet that is an argument that is put forward so often. What many people do ask, and again, it's a legitimate question, is I talk about Apollo 17, that the last mission to the moon was 1972. Why haven't we gone back? And I thought I would explain with the environment that I grew up in. I was born in 1968, so I just about remember the last landing on the moon. Very grainy, black and white footage on TV. But this was a book this is a card, an album that I had as a child, where we used to get these cards that you would get in packets of tea, and this is my actual one from back when I was a child. Now, when I was a child, the idea was that after Apollo, there was going to be extended missions to the moon with Moon Lab. There would be human missions to Mars in the early 1980s. And people often ask, well, why did all that just fall aside? Why did we get the history that we have? Well, at the time of Project Apollo, once the race to the moon was won, the extended missions in the last phase of Project Apollo, 15, 16, 17, produced an enormous science yield. But it was a time when the Vietnam War was on, the political battle had been won, and of course, the question about all the money that had been spent was being asked. NASA changed its priorities, as did the Soviet Union. From the American perspective, having won the race to the moon, the challenge was, can we reduce the cost of access to space? And this was then the development of the partially reusable space shuttle concept for low Earth orbit use. In other words, for deploying satellites and potentially building a space station. From the Soviet Union's perspective, having lost the race to the moon, they effectively airbrushed it out of their history as if it had never been a challenge. And instead, they became masters of space stations, because the longest mission to the moon, Apollo 17, was 12 days long, sort of 3.5 days out and back, and then several days orbiting the moon. What would it take to survive for a month in space? 3 months in space, 6 months in space, a year in space. And as I say, the Soviets became the masters with the Salyut series of space stations. But the culmination of this was the Mir space station, which you can see here, the first components of which were launched in 1986. Now, while I wanted to show you this image, this is the Mir space station docking with the US space shuttle Atlantis in 1997. And I wanted to share this with you because, 30 years ago, 1987, 1988, I was pretty much in the position of many of you. I was an undergraduate at university studying physics. If you'd have said to me in 1987, so a decade before this picture was taken, Mir had been launched. If you'd have said to me, I would see a Soviet space station like Mir docking with the United States space shuttle, I would have said impossible. Because, of course, in 1987, it was still the presidency of Ronald Reagan. The Cold War was still going in full flow. It would have seemed impossible. But of course, rapid geopolitical change, in this case, the collapse of the Soviet Union, leads to new possibilities and can lead to new possibilities very quickly. And it was this initial collaboration in the Shuttle Mir program that led to the program that we now see, the construction and the continuous occupation now for 20 years of the International Space Station. Now, this structure is huge. 15 countries have collaborated. It's the size of a football field with a mass of nearly 500 tons. The first components were assembled in 1998, and it is fair to say this was only possible with the space shuttle's heavy lifting capability and the long-term expertise of Russia, or the former Soviet Union, because of their experience with space stations. And when we look at the ISS, we need to remember, I'm going to show you a video that's been put together by some of my colleagues. We need to remember that many of these components were built in places around the world. The first time they ever met was in low Earth orbit, when they were traveling at a velocity of 5 miles or 8 kilometers every second. The ISS is an international laboratory for research to be conducted by researchers from around the world, more than 100 countries, and nearly 4,000 science investigations have been done on board station, as well as, of course, as being the home for astronauts for up to the general crew complement is 6 months at a time. The crew, the longest missions on ISS were 340 days. And we see ISS operations carrying on for the next 10 years. One legacy that I think is to be welcomed is best represented in this image. This is from STS-131, a shuttle mission to rendezvous with the International Space Station from several years ago. And what I love about this is it shows how much the human spaceflight experience has changed in the last 40 years. Because with one exception, Valentina Tereshkova, if you'd have taken a picture like this in the 1960s, all of these astronauts or cosmonauts would have been male. They all would have been of European origin. They all would have had a piloting background, all been trained as pilots. What we now see is a representation of ethnicities from around the world, of agencies from around the world, and professional backgrounds that go outside what most people would consider the regular ones to apply for an astronaut. So yeah, we've got your scientists, your engineers, your pilots, but we've also got people at the 3 o'clock position like Dottie Metcalf-Lindenberger, who till 2004 was a high school science teacher before she was selected by NASA as an astronaut. We're seeing a broadening of the human spaceflight experience. Many people say, well, if we had that technology 50 years ago, how come we can't do it instantly today? Why would it be a mammoth undertaking to go back to the moon? And the best way of illustrating this is the case of Concorde, because Concorde was a supersonic airliner that was developed in the 1960s. When Concorde was developed, and when I was a child, the idea was that Concorde was going to revolutionize passenger air travel. There were going to be hundreds of them built, and supersonic travel was the future. Being an Anglo-French construct, and of course the Soviet Union developing the Tu-144, the Americans had decided to build an even bigger version of Concorde, the Boeing 2707. But the reality was that only 16 production Concordes were ever built. The last one flew in 2003. And if we were to build a new supersonic airliner, okay, we've lost that experience base. It will be a decade-long undertaking. The fact that it would be a decade-long undertaking, does that mean that Concorde was faked? Of course not. So it is possible to have all of this expertise, to lose a lot of that collective expertise, and to have to start again in many respects. Now, I've tried to answer some of the issues here, but now I want to sort of turn tables and look at some of the questions that I want to pose to conspiracy theorists. I've listed them out here. You know, in terms of Project Apollo, 400,000 people were involved. How could they have kept it all a secret? If you get away with it once in faking your first successful moon landing, why do you do it 5 more times on 5 subsequent missions that succeeded? A really important one is encapsulated in the next 2 points, because as scientists we know that if you have a theory, you publish it in an academic journal, and you expect it to be ripped apart if it does not stand that sort of scrutiny. Conspiracy theorists do not do that. Instead, they publish them online, where they are free to have whatever impact they want, regardless of their validity. You can see a couple of other points, but I want to go to the last point, which is that very often people who are subscribing to one conspiracy theory will be much more amenable to others as well. And you know, there are some interesting studies about what is it about the conspiratorial frame of mind that certain people, perhaps very you know, intelligent people, this is not to do with intelligence, may find themselves more susceptible to being reeled in by conspiracy theories. On the right hand side, I've got Julian Assange from several years ago. What I also find interesting is the entire trove of WikiLeaks leaks, which in many cases have been shocking, and they're all real in terms of government restricted cables or classified telegrams that were sent. You do not see any reference to the Apollo program being false, and yet WikiLeaks is such a source of research for so many conspiracy theorists looking at other theories that are put forward. I think very often, you know, if you have a conspiracy theory that's put forward to explain something, you shouldn't just dismiss it out of turn. But instead, we should apply some fundamental principles. And those are the principles of science, but also critical thinking and Occam's razor, a centuries-old philosophical tool that is a nice rule of thumb that says, in broad speaking terms, you know, if you have several competing explanations, you know, sometimes it's said the simplest one is likely to be the most obvious one. It's not so much that. It's saying that the most straightforward explanation that is in line with scientific principles is likely to be the correct one. And just to illustrate the burden of proof that we use in science, I want to introduce you to a couple of props that I have here. And the first one is this rock here. Now, no spacecraft yet has gone to the surface of Mars and brought a sample back. Mars Sample Return is a project that myself and my colleagues are working on as an international endeavor, as a very high-profile science target for the late 2020s. But I actually have here a sample of the planet Mars in my hand. You know, now an extraordinary claim, it requires extraordinary evidence. So what is the evidence here? This is a meteorite called NWA 12564 that fell in Northwest Africa and was discovered several years ago by a colleague of mine. How do we know that this is Martian? Well, we need to do a battery of tests. So there are gases trapped inside that are a precise match for the gases we find in Mars's atmosphere. And we've had surface truth on Mars since 1976 with the Viking landers. We also find that this has been exposed to galactic cosmic radiation that says it was in space for millions of years. So what we need to do is we need to create a narrative that explains the evidence that we see. And the best narrative that we can create is that millions of years ago, an asteroid smashed into the surface of Mars, blasted these rocks into space, and they've ended up here on Earth. And we got more than 150 meteorites that are Martian in origin. And we have lunar meteorites, we have meteorites that originate from the asteroids like Ceres and Vesta and so on. That's NWA 12564. But to go back to my slide of NACLA in just a second, these are some fragments of another Martian meteorite that is far more, I won't say controversial, but interesting. And you can just about see them here. Now, what I'd like you to do, if we can go back to my slide, please. The NACLA meteorite is one of these 150 meteorites that are confirmed as being Martian in origin. I've got a few granules here. What's interesting about NACLA is that when electron microscopy was done, and we've got images here that are magnifying up 150,000 times, we see features that some astrobiologists, and I'm being very careful with what I say, world-leading authorities, some astrobiologists are saying are evidence of biological processes in the early geological history of Mars. Now, I say some astrobiologists who I very much respect. So am I holding evidence of ancient Martian life in my hands? Now, I want that so much to be the case. I really, really want these features to be evidence of ancient Martian microbial life. And maybe they are, but we need a very high burden of proof. There are alternative, non-biological explanations which can be evoked to explain some of these features. This is the caution of science. But as a scientist, of course, we need to put forward these multiple arguments and talk about the weight of evidence that support each case. That is not the way that so many conspiracists will present their evidence. I want to talk a little bit about the issues surrounding 9/11. As I say, it's the single geopolitical event in the last 20 years that has helped shape the early years of the 21st century. These are three of the arguments that are put forward by conspiracy theories, and they're all absolutely correct. But what I want to do is I want to explain why each of these points in itself doesn't mean that the conventional narrative of hijacked aircraft being flown into the Twin Towers is necessarily false. Let's look at the first one about being designed to survive an airliner strike. World Trade Centers were designed in the 1960s, topped out in the early 1970s. And the idea was that perhaps a Boeing 707 size airliner coming into land at what is now John F. Kennedy Airport at about 200 miles an hour might be off course in bad visibility and hit the tower. So the building was designed to take that impact. What it was not designed to take was the impact of a much larger aircraft like a 767 flying not at 200 miles an hour or 160 miles an hour coming to land, but flying at nearly 3 times that speed. And of course, if we do the kinetic energy modeling, you can see that the actual impact of those airliners on the structure was nearly 10 times more than what had been modeled as being a realistic possibility in the 1960s. And in terms of the melting point of steel, these are, I'm sorry that my representation has faded a little bit. These are stress strain curves of the strength of steel, Young's modulus, and how it changes at different temperatures. And when you look at these, we can see that you don't need to get near the melting point of steel to start to get a real change in the stress strain curve behavior of steel. Coupled with the structure of the World Trade Center and the way that the impact was and the way that the burning fuel went into the structure, then it is entirely feasible that the narrative, the conventional narrative, is correct. Because if you've got burning fuel that is then spreading in the structure, you start to get weakening of the structure. And of course, once the weakening of the structure occurs and you've got a suppression of these stress strain curves, then of course, eventually that material is going to give. And of course, when 2 million tons of concrete supported by a steel girder framework goes into free fall, it's going to look like a controlled demolition, because that's how controlled demolitions work. Find the weak point, compromise the weak point, and let gravity do the rest. So what we see when we're looking at what I call the conspiracist toolkit are some very sophisticated methodologies of how evidence is distorted or misrepresented. The modeling is often simplistic. We see often doublethink and duckspeak, to quote George Orwell from 1984. There's a lot of rhetorical approaches that are used, and critically, no peer review when they are put online. Seed an idea online, and of course, it will flourish. Now, for many years, I thought conspiracy theories and ideas like this were pretty much just entertainment. We can look at phenomena like Psychics TV or Uri Geller and his spoon bending, or even those of the United Kingdom might remember Dr. Gillian McKeith, who had bought her PhD from an online mill college in the United States and sold millions of books with no medical background. I thought it was a little bit of fun. I thought it was harmless. And of course, we can go down the approach of saying, well, of course, this is nonsensical. And I used to wonder, well, this is just about the pointy hat brigade. Why are we worrying? But then we saw a very new phenomenon that really manifested itself large scale in 2007, 2008. And it was the use of conspiratorial thinking and conspiratorial ways of distorting information in a very sophisticated way by politicians. We saw it in in terms of the first US election and the issues that were brought up about President Obama's birth certificate. We saw it much more several years later, manifesting itself within the sort of arguments about Brexit. And of course, we now know all of the arguments that are raging about fake news, about, as Kellyanne Conway will say, alternative facts, about the way that these tools of distortion and misinformation spreading online are powerful and resonate with people, especially when people may feel marginalized, especially when people are feeling that they're not being listened to. And so I think the importance of this issue cannot be overstated. You know, addressing critical thinking skills and their importance in the fight against fake news, in the fight against devolving away the ability to think for ourselves, in starting to look at the credibility of academic sources. This is a battle that we have to engage in. We cannot just say, well, this isn't important. How can people be so silly? Because many of the people who are taken in by conspiracy theories are very intelligent, are very aware, but in some cases are very, very limited in what they are saying. I just want to talk about George Orwell because in 1984, that was written, you know, just after World War II, he talks about a future that's dominated by three global powers. So much of 1984 is prescient, not in terms of the evolution of geopolitics, but in the way that the tools of disinformation are used so effectively by politicians. This really is a challenge for our times. Carl Sagan, who is a great science popularizer and a great astronomer, wrote about this decades ago, and he talked about science as being a candle in the dark. When I look at the role of the vast amount of information that is online and the way that distortion and misrepresentation is being used, the way I see things is that we find ourselves awash in an ocean of information, and it is an ocean that is getting deeper every day. It has whirlpools and eddies and currents, and the only tools we have to navigate through this ocean of disinformation are those fundamental critical thinking skills that are at the heart of the methodology that we inculcate, that we use in science. And so for me, you know, Carl Sagan talks about a candle in the dark. I talk about navigating a turbulent ocean of disinformation. You know, the challenge is clear, and I would argue that it's one of the biggest challenges of our time. After all that, though, I want to finish on a positive note. Many of you now will be aware of Project Artemis. Now, this was an initiative that was initiated by President Donald Trump, and it was a much more aggressive return to the moon, with the target being a return of humans to the moon and the first woman on the moon by 2024. Now, with the political changes that are happening, we may see a slight pushing back of that deadline by a few years, but that still is a prime focus for the future. Why am I so excited about Artemis and a human return to the moon? Well, it's Space Policy Directive #1 under the Trump administration, and I expect under Biden that we'll get a continuation. The European Space Agency is involved with this, so Europe and many other nations are involved with the return of humans to the moon. We have picked a landing site, so Shackleton Crater at the south polar regions of the moon. We have looked at the manifest of missions that is required, and this is technologically achievable. Yes, it's a budgetary and political challenge, but it's technologically achievable. And one of the reasons why I'm so excited about it is that, you know, I'm of a generation that remembers the last lunar landing. Yes, I was only 4 years old, but I just about remember it. And what strikes me is that when we look at those voyages of exploration 50 years ago, the photographic record is stunning with the Hasselblad photography. And I have two examples of books that are some of the best representations that you see. But as humans, we're a very visual species. And the trouble is that the video technology of the time was so primitive compared to now that even on the final 3 lunar missions, you know, the sorts of video footage we got was incredibly grainy. We have no real way of connecting with the visceral experience of those Apollo astronauts 50 years ago as they were directly exploring an alien world. But we now have systems orbiting the moon that show us what the moon looks like to the human eye in a way that we can recognize. This is a lunar reconnaissance orbiter image taken of the Earth from the moon. And in a few years' time, we're going to have humans back in lunar orbit on the lunar surface. They'll be seeing this and relaying back to us HD imagery. We will vicariously be exploring the moon with them. And I think when we do, and we see image sets like this, we will start to get a real emotional connection with realizing just how astonishing those Apollo voyages of discovery were nearly more than half a century ago. Nearly half a century ago. The final point I want to bring here goes beyond Apollo, because when we look at the Earth from the moon, we can see what a unique and astonishing world the Earth is, because here is a world that is not only teeming with life, but life has fundamentally changed the evolution of the atmosphere, the oceans, the geology of our planet for billions of years. And this is detectable from astronomical distances. You know, if I was an alien visitor to our solar system, forget about the majesty and the grandeur of Jupiter and Saturn and their dozens of moons. I would come hot-tailing it to this third rock from the sun, because uniquely in the solar system, this is a world where not only is there life, there may be life elsewhere, but this is a place where life has fundamentally changed the geology of our planet in a measurable, in a meaningful way for billions of years. What space has taught us is just how very, very special our home planet is. And I'd like to conclude with the thoughts of the Apollo 15 commander, Dave Scott, as he stepped out on what was arguably the most beautiful of the Apollo landing sites. So this is the summer of 1971. It's the Valley of Hadley Apennine. And this is Dave Scott's first words on the surface of the moon. While standing here today, I'm reminded of a fundamental truth. Humanity must explore, and this is exploration at its greatest. You know, for a long time, I thought Dave Scott was talking about space exploration, but what I now believe is he's talking about the voyage of exploration that the human race has done, you know, for the last 200,000 years since we left Africa and we spread out around the world. And it's been the voyage of exploration and development that's only been possible because of our development of passing on wisdom from one generation to the next, our use of language, our education system, our thinking skills, our skills in science, technology, medicine, etc. In other words, critical thinking skills and education have been absolutely critical in looking at human development for the last 200,000 years. And if we are to continue that journey, it is imperative that we continue to embrace and utilize the scientific methodology of critical thinking. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. It's been a real honor and privilege to be able to present to you, and I'd be delighted to take any questions that you may have. Thank you very much, everyone, and I'm going to hand back to Anka and also just mute my PowerPoint to make sure we don't get any feedback. So I'm going to stop sharing there. Anka, over to you.
Great. Thanks, Anu, for such a brilliant talk. That was absolutely amazing. So we have several questions for you from various different streaming sites. So let's see the first one, please. Okay, so this is from Martin. The oldest light we have observed is 13.8 billion years old, but the diameter of the universe is 93 billion light years. Could you please explain how we figure that out?
Yeah, no, this is a really good question, and I mean, I'm not a cosmologist, but what we are looking at is the differential rates of the expansion of the universe. And so when you see the figure of 93 billion light years, what's been done there is effectively a correction has been made in the calculations for that differential rate of expansion of the universe. Of course, we've got an accelerated expansion at the moment. So this is why I think as an astronomical community, we need to have greater clarity when we are putting forward explanations like that, because it's all very well for somebody who knows about differential rates of expansion to then say, well, 93 billion years, because everyone will say, yeah, of course you're taking into account the correction factor there. But then when it is not explained properly, we get questions like this. So my answer is it's a correction for the differential rate of expansion of the universe. By the way, if there are any cosmologists who explain this much better, I'd be happy to do that. This is not my field of expertise, but I would say that but that is an area that illustrates that I think in science communication we need to do a much better job, because people will rightly see what they think of as an inconsistency there.
Yeah,
it's a really good question.
I was just about to ask, do you think that in some ways scientists should also be clearer in their explanations with certain topics to like people who aren't necessarily experts, to avoid some of this?
Oh, absolutely. And do you know what? I'll go further, because I say this to my scientific colleagues very often. Scientists will say, well, we're spending public money for the good and this is our right. And of course, anything we do in public engagement, well, we're doing it for the greater good. And there can sometimes be a quite patronizing air there. The reason we need to do this is not only because the public is paying for us, but because we've now got a time when the public will rightly hold us up to scrutiny. If I look back at the Fukushima nuclear disaster that happened several years ago in Japan, I think that one of the factors, not the only factor, one of the factors for Germany doing a complete U-turn in its policy on nuclear power was because they had not done a good enough job of explaining their nuclear program in a way that the public would understand and recognize and work with. That's just one example. So I think that public communication, science communication is no longer a nice to have. It is a fundamental strategic driver. And to be honest, scientists and research councils need to be having far more prioritization in this area, because people will rightly be wanting to interrogate what they're being told. And the distrust of science is really, really worrying. But I do sometimes wonder, in some ways, is this because we as a community have not done enough to engage with the public in a two-way discourse?
Yeah, for sure. I feel like there is certainly it can be quite easily to get trapped in your sort of isolated bubble of research. Like even within your own research field, that you just end up focusing on your particular area.
Absolutely. Just one thing I just want to point out before I take the next question, because what I'm saying is that when people are coming up with concerns about theories that are being proposed, the worst thing you can do is just say that's nonsense. Yeah. There are examples of concepts that were considered conspiracy theories that have been proved right. One of them, the Tuskegee syphilis scandal, which if you read about it, when the idea was put forward, first of all, that, African Americans had been deliberately infected with syphilis and effectively just left to their own devices, people would have said that's a conspiracy theory. That was absolutely true. So when you have these ideas being put forward, you must look at them objectively and you mustn't just dismiss them out of hand. And I would say that part of what science has sometimes done is had a very arrogant position in terms of the way it is engaging with society. And we need to completely get rid of that.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. So thank you for such a good answer. So let's see the next question, please. Just a sec. Okay. So this is from Stephen Cowie. Given the values that conspiracy theorists hold, how would you engage with them to open their minds to, disengage their cognitive dissonance?
Do you know, I think what you don't want to do is just go in machine guns blazing, because we're all, even as scientists, egos come into play with science. We all, if we are criticized, it's a human reaction to retreat. So what you have to do is to open dialogue and to ask, well, why do you believe this? And now I've done this many times in many different areas, and try to unpick why their thinking is the way it is. And then time needs to be taken. And we need to go through, and I have to be honest, very often when you're talking in this way, that you have a time to build up trust. Now, it could be said that I've been a bit bombastic in my lecture. I only had like 55 minutes. If I'm going to talk with a conspiracy theorist, I wouldn't be doing it in 45 minutes like this. I'd be taking a lot more time. So I think it's about building, first of all, dialogue, engage, and explain the scientific methodology. Many people don't understand the business of peer review. They don't realize the rigor to which scientists' evidence base will be interrogated when a new theory is being put forward. Very often when I explain that, the level of rigor and scrutiny, I know peer review isn't perfect, but the level of rigor and scrutiny that scientific theories will be subject to before being published in an academic journal, they're really surprised. They say, I never knew it was like that. And then they start to understand why we have this huge body of evidence that will back up the foundations of ideas that are being published and put forward. And of course, pointing out that I think it was Bertrand Russell who said that, science cannot claim to be the 100% objective truth, because we're always working iteratively to improve the models we have.
Yeah, I think a lot of people don't realize that they sort of assume that science isn't really an ever-changing subject. They think it's just constant, like that there are just like constant, almost like doctrines of truth in a way.
Yeah.
And I think once people realize that it's not like that, there is actually a lot in science that's uncertain, they kind of start to understand more why certain things are the way they are in scientific research.
Absolutely.
Okay. So then let's see the next question. How much would it have cost to actually fake the moon landing in 1969? So I've heard about this, that someone said it would actually be almost more expensive. I don't know how.
That is a really good question. I don't know is the answer, but what I would say is the Mythbusters series did a really good program, which you can look up online, when they tried to sort of fake various aspects, and they do talk about sort of cost implications and so on. I think to have gone to the scale of faking what was done there would have been, it's a bit of a cliche, but harder than actually doing the mission, because all of the inconsistencies that are brought up by conspiracy theories, I'm happy with them bringing them up, but they are explanations that make sense scientifically behind all of them. And so there is nothing that I see that gives me reason to question the narrative, not because I'm blindly looking at them, but because when I look at what's being put forward by the conspiracy theorists, I'm either saying, no, that's a misapplication of science within the parameter space that it should be applied, or that doesn't seem to be internally self-consistent. So have a look at Mythbusters, because they did a great program on what it would take to fake the moon landings.
Okay, yeah. So I'm definitely going to check that out. That was really cool. Okay, I think we've got a few more questions, so we can have the next one. How can scientists tackle the spread of misinformation?
We are only a few days since the phase 3 Pfizer results, and we're hoping to get other phase 3 vaccine results, but this is one of the biggest challenge in terms of anti-vaxxers at the moment. Again, I have no problem with people questioning about vaccines and efficacy, etc. That's good that they're questioning, but then they need to look at the body of evidence behind. In other words, if you're going to throw a hand grenade of a question in to question things, you need to sit and you need to listen to the answers. So how do scientists tackle the spread? I think it needs a multi-leveled communications campaign. The evidence needs to be presented in a way that doesn't patronize people, but doesn't get too complex. I mean,
sorry, I didn't mean, but it kind of reminds me of when I think it was Chris Whitty, like a couple of weeks ago, was doing a sort of a talk about like the sort of the death rates and the spread of COVID across the country, and he just kept showing like loads of slides, and I was just I remember I was thinking, like, if you're not an expert in epidemiology or like disease spread, that's like, just, you cannot absorb that information.
And as scientists, we need to remember that. Like, sometimes we'd say, as scientists, we're fine with that. Yeah, bring it on. But I know, as scientists, if you show us spreadsheets of economic performance, we'll switch off and we'll say, give us the summary. So, this is a human thing, that if you are outside your area of specialization, you want to have a summary that is accessible.
Yeah.
And so I think that there are ways in which as scientists, we need to take that on board. That we need to up our communication skills and work with the very best communicators who may not be scientists themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you think that there's also a role that the media can, like sort of the BBC and CNN and other sort of mainstream media networks, can play to reduce this sort of thing? Because I know after like the news of the phase 3 vaccine came out, it was all over the media as if like, you know, COVID's going to be cured and that sort of thing. When in reality, it is like, it's good news, but it's obviously not. It's still going to be a while before like the vaccine can come out.
Now, you know, it's interesting. I think the media has a role. I have to be honest. You know, I could see the scientists on the day, the epidemiologists, and the other medical scientists being very cautious, which they were right to do. But I have to say, at a human level, you know, when Sir John Bell, I think it was, who came out saying, well, you know, I'm going to be the first to say this. Yes, it means that you have to look at human hope. We are humans. And so I don't think you should just, there's nothing wrong with like, this is such a joyful moment. It's such a moment of optimism. There's nothing wrong with expressing that and then putting the caveats. I think sometimes as scientists, we put the caveats in first and we forget that there is a human response to this global pandemic, this global situation we find ourselves in.
Absolutely.
There's nothing wrong with giving the optimistic picture first and then the caveat. Sometimes as scientists, we tend to be in communication too caveat driven.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's just striking that balance right. I think
absolutely
is the important thing. Okay, I think we've got time for one more question, if we can see that. Could you comment on the fact, I get this is kind of covered by what you were talking about. Could you comment on the fact that we managed to go to the moon in the 1960s, but we haven't done anything similar in the past few decades?
Yeah, I mean, I'll summarize. I did address that because of like changing priorities. We changed our priorities. In the ISS, the assembly is a more impressive engineering challenge than Project Apollo. I'm not just saying that, you know, my involvement as a PI on an ISS experiment. I'm not just saying it for that. I started off as an ISS cynic when it was first mooted as an idea. The other thing is though, well, there's Concorde. The deepest spot in the Earth's oceans, Challenger Deep, the Marianas Trench. You know, 1960, the bathyscaphe Trieste went down, and the next descent into Challenger Deep, 11 kilometers down, didn't happen for another 50 years. So you attain something. We did some, you know, the science yield from Apollo, the geologists will tell you, was phenomenal. And it's not questioned by geologists all over the world. But then suddenly the priorities change. But what we did do is, instead of extended human bases on the moon, which is what I expected when I was younger, you know, we had this change of priorities with much more planetary exploration with robotic systems, with much more exploitation in low Earth orbit with the ISS and with other space stations. So you can talk about a lost future in which humans did build on the 1960s legacy, and we had permanent bases on the moon, you know, decades ago. But then we wouldn't have had the other achievements that we had in the interim. Yeah, you know, alternate futures are always interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's just, I guess, is, you know, sort of actually seeing people on the moon. It has a bigger direct impact again on people who aren't necessarily, you know, specialists in a way. I guess they just see like, oh, like we're actually landing on like different planetary like systems or surfaces on the solar system. I guess that sort of, it's a simpler achievement to understand in a way. Okay, so I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today, unfortunately. Thank you everyone who tuned in and was watching. And Anu, it was an absolute pleasure to host you today. This was
thank you very much.
Amazing talk and incredibly relevant in today's climate. Join us all next week when we will be hosting Professor Emily Flashman to talk about plants and their response to stresses such as flooding. Take care, everyone, and stay safe. Bye-bye.